super fun, and all about artisan cheese and more to melt your peaceful heart and toast your peaceful life. Coming to you from the Appalachian Mountains of southwestern Virginia, this is the Peaceful Heart FarmCast.
Hey, this is Scott Hall from Peaceful Heart Farm, and you are listening to the Peaceful Heart FarmCast.
Hello, everybody. Melanie Hall here. Hope you're doing very well. The conversation today and every day revolves around the value of tradition, traditional homestead living, traditional raw milk products, and artisan cheese. Topics discussed here are designed to create new perspectives and possibilities for how you might add the taste of tradition to your life. Have you ever wondered, why does cheese melt? Well, I'm going to talk about that today. What would we do without cheese that melts? Some are gooey, others stretch forever. I mean, pizza wouldn't be pizza without stretchy cheese. And what about that oozing cheese on a grilled cheese sandwich? Okay, now I'm hungry. As always, let me take a moment for new listeners. Welcome to the show. And again, as always, welcome back to the veteran homestead-loving regulars who stop by the FarmCast for every episode. I appreciate you all so much. I'm so excited to share with you what's going on at the farm this week, as well as some insight into why does cheese melt. Let's talk about the garden. The tomatoes are coming in fast now. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them are out there on the vines. Twice I've picked tomatoes. Twice. I brought in a 5-gallon bucket full both times. On a day not very far in the future, that might turn into 2 or even 3 5-gallon buckets at a time. A couple of the plants are in real trouble now, and for those, I will likely have to pick all of the tomatoes on them in the next few days, even if they are still green. That's really only about 3 or 4 plants. There are 50 in the row. There's lots of tomatoes left to ripen. There's lots of plants out there that are going to keep going. Now, the tomato vines were tied up with baling twine tied to iron rebar. And then the rebar is driven in, and then the baling twine went across there. I think 3 different rows at 3 different levels of it. And they also are in tomato cages. So they're in the cages, and then the cages were kind of tied to the rebar so that the cages would stay upright. Well, the weight of the tomatoes has taken down that half-hearted trellis. Well, it's still there, but it's leaning over quite sharply, especially in some places. So next year will require a modification. That's the way of our homestead. You try something one year, you see what works well, what didn't work. The next year you make improvements, keep the good stuff, modify the less than desirable, and we get closer and closer to the perfect garden. We're getting there. The sunflowers are blooming, as I've said. I'm not sure when to cut them down before the birds go crazy for sure, but exactly when, I don't know yet. These sunflowers have been a great little fun project for me. Who would have thought I would have enjoyed them so much? I hope I get the hang of harvesting them. I'm looking forward to next year and another great growing season for sunflowers. So we'll see how that harvesting goes. That might be the real learning curve in all of this. The onions, I haven't really talked about the onions because they just grow. They just put them in the ground. They grew. Well, they fell over, dried out. And so I had one entire bed that I finally dug up. The onions can stay in the ground, but they can rot if it is wet. And after weeks of no rain, we're getting rain nearly every day. In fact, I can hear the thunder right now. Yet another afternoon thunderstorm is upon us. So I got the onions in, getting those dried out. Now, the dried beans, I haven't talked about them much either. That's another thing. You just put them in the ground. They grow. They dry up. You go out there and you pick them. So I pulled up all of the plants that were completely dry, and all the pods were dry. So I pulled up each plant, stripped the dried bean pods off, and then threw it aside. So it was easy to go through there and pick them really quickly. There's still a bed of red beans and one of white beans, and both of those have a lot of plants that are still somewhat green, and I'm going to let them dry a bit more before I go in and pick all of those pods. It's been a great year for dried beans. They did really well. I also picked many of the baby lima beans. We had a meal of the green ones a couple nights ago. I love green baby lima beans. Now, the rest of what I picked had already dried in the shell, and those will be shelled out and stored for winter. There are a lot more still in the garden, still growing. In fact, they're still blooming a little bit. We'll be having lima bean harvest for a little while yet. The peppers, the hot cherry peppers are really producing. I'll be using them in another canned pickle pepper recipe, and some of them though will be dried, so that I'm going to dry a lot of peppers this year. I have so many green peppers right now. Likely I have enough green peppers to absolutely fill the dehydrator with just that one pepper, and it has 9 shelves. And there's still more green peppers out in the garden. We are blessed with abundance there. And yeah, that's what I was looking for. Now, the culinary herbs, that's actually another area of abundance. I'm a little disappointed with the parsley, the cilantro, the rosemary. There's always a next year. This year, it's the basil, oregano, and thyme that are magical in their growth. The dehydrator will be getting many of those leaves as well. Now let me move on to the quail. You know, I love talking about the quail. I started up the incubator once again. This is the last time this year. The earliest I would I would be able to collect eggs again is, let's see, the last week of September, and I'm pretty sure that would be too late. I learned my lesson last year with 48 eggs in the incubator and only 8 hatched. Somewhere around mid-September, the hens dramatically reduce the number of eggs they are laying, and that's due to the reduced hours of sunlight. The roosters become infertile around the same time. It's probably an evolutionary survival kind of thing. You know, there's no use wasting time with baby birds in the wintertime. Nope. That's the time to try and keep yourself alive. It can be tough on birds trying to forage through the snow. Birds need protein. They need lots of protein. And all the bugs are gone. The frogs are hibernating. Worms have gone farther underground where it isn't so cold. What's a bird to eat? Well, I'll be throwing out some sunflower seeds for my birds. Anyway, late September eggs will be few and infertile. So I have 80 eggs in the incubator. We shall see in 3 weeks how it all comes out. Now, as far as the other animals and the cows and such, I don't really have much to say, except for the cows all look healthy, and Butter's even starting to look fat. It's an unusual sight for a Jersey. The one thing I will mention is the mud that the cows are generating around the pond. These animals are big. In the summer, they like to hang out in the pond. Literally, they stand in the water up to their belly. It's cool and keeps those giant botflies off of their belly. And a few years back, they got into the habit of coming out of the pond at the same location time and time again. And the result was that the bank broke down. And eventually the pond stretched all the way to the fence. It just kept getting there. Originally there was a strip of land more than 6 feet wide, and it just kept getting narrower and narrower, and now it's all gone. The pond goes all the way to the fence. So not only is the pond all the way to the fence, but it's mud, and the rest of the pathway is churned into mud. So I'm prepared for mud. I have some really great rubber boots that allow me to slog around just about anywhere. And a couple of days ago, I went out to bring the girls in for milking. And instead of finding them grazing in the pasture, they were still in the pond. Now, I really didn't want to have to go across that mud to get them moving toward the milk shed. So I tried getting them to move from outside the fence. I went around, got behind them and yelled at them a little bit and, waved my stick at them, and they just looked at me. So I had to bite the bullet and make my way across that mud to get them moving. And it's not just one time. I had to follow them back across the mud, too. And coming back, I was really, really careful because on the way over, I sunk up in that mud so far that my boot was stuck. The mud was over a foot deep. When I tried to pull my boot out to make the next step, my foot came out and the boot stayed where it was. I put my foot back in the boot and I wriggled and pulled until I got it loose. Well, now I'm in the middle of the mud pit. So I take another step and the other boot is stuck fast in the mud. I repeated the procedure of wriggling while I'm pulling to get the boot out as well. Now, thankfully, those 2 steps got me to a little bit more solid ground, maybe only 4 to 6 inches deep. And I tried a different route on the way back, and I managed to only get 1 boot stuck on the return trip. Really, the mud over that stretch of land is over a foot deep in places. Those 1,500-pound cows can create quite the muddy swamp. It's a real mess, a real mess. Just another task on the to-do list to get that fixed. Enough of that. Let's talk cheese. Let's talk, why does cheese melt? Well, there are 2 things that happen when cheese melts. First, at about 90 degrees, the solid milk fat in the cheese begins to liquefy. You'll see the cheese softening. You might also see beads of melted fat rising to the surface. Second, as the cheese gets hotter, the bonds holding together the casein proteins break apart, and the cheese melts into a thick fluid. The complete melting happens at different temperatures for different cheeses. Mozzarella, which is a fresh, meaning it's not aged, cheese, it is a soft, high moisture cheese, and it will melt at about 130 degrees. For aged cheeses with a much lower moisture, such as our cheddar or our alpine cheese like Gruyere, which we call Pinnacle, the melting happens at about 150 degrees. And for your really hard cheeses that are grated, like Parmesan, a temperature of 180 degrees is required to get the cheese to melt. Now, what makes a good melting cheese? There are 3 things that determine the meltability of cheese. You got moisture content, which I just talked about, whether it's fresh or aged, and for how long, and then how it was curded. What was used to make the curd? Was it animal rennet or was it some type of acid? The higher the moisture content, the more easily the flow. There's just more water. The moist cheese contains a lot of water, and that water is interspersed between the proteins, so they readily liquefy. Now, a hard cheese, all the way on the other end, contains much less water, so when they melt, they don't completely liquefy. So you can see these 2 extremes illustrated on a pizza. You have mozzarella and you have Parmesan Reggiano. So mozzarella is grated and sprinkled on the pizza, and remember, that's a fresh, high moisture cheese. And when the heat is added, only even up to 130 degrees, that mozzarella melts into one big pool of cheese. You can't see those individual pieces of grated cheese that you put on there. It just becomes big globs and pools of cheese. So that's the effect of moisture. And on the other end of the scale, the Parmesan is a very, very low moisture and very hard cheese. So you're using the smaller grater, and when you grate it, it comes out finer, and the grated pieces are much thinner and shorter. And when they're melted, you can still see the individual strands of Parmesan cheese. It never really merges together. And that, again, that's the effect of low moisture. So lots of water makes a nice pool of cheese. No moisture, it holds its shape better. Now let's talk about age. The age of a cheese, it can also be a factor. In a fresh cheese like mozzarella, the casein protein molecules are large and stretchy. They tend to tangle up and form a rope. They get stringy. With an aged cheese, the casein molecules are acted upon by ripening enzymes which break the casein into smaller pieces. So you don't have those big, large, stretchy ones. You have small pieces. And that keeps those molecules from tangling together when they melt. The result is that smooth, oozy melt. Or in the case of Parmesan, it's smooth. Again, they're really dry. It's smooth, but it's not so much ooze there. Again, the less moisture, the less ooze that you're going to have. Now let's talk about acidity. A cheese made by using acid to form the curd won't melt at all. These cheeses include Indian paneer, Mexican queso blanco, Italian ricotta, Greek halloumi, most of your fresh goat cheeses, and most vegetarian cheeses. So what you have with everything except the vegetarian cheeses, you're using an acid to form the cheese, and the acid is going to be vinegar or lemon juice. Usually those are the two acids that are normally used to make those cheeses. And then with a vegetarian cheese, you're using vegetarian rennet. And so those have trouble melting. Using animal rennet keeps the calcium to protein bond intact. An acid-curded cheese, the proteins are held together simply by the proteins binding to one another. So you throw the acid in there and the proteins bind together. Whereas when you use rennet, it's a more gradual process of the calcium bonding to the protein. And that acid, when you're using acid to make the curd, it dissolves the calcium bond. When that acid cheese is heated, it doesn't melt. In fact, the protein bonds even tighter, forcing out more water. Then the water evaporates and there isn't enough moisture left to allow the cheese to liquefy. So cheeses like queso blanco and paneer can be simmered or even fried without melting. And they're still yummy. And you have ricotta, fresh goat cheese. They're going to retain their shape in your lasagna or your manicotti. You can still see the crumbles of those cheeses once it's warmed up. Now, let me give you a few tips for smooth melted cheese, right? If you're going to have a good melting cheese, you want to be able to do it properly. So the first thing that you're going to do is bring your cheese to room temperature. It's the sudden temperature change that can cause the protein to coagulate too quickly, and it'll squeeze out the fat. And if that happens, that cheese is going to clump, and it's going to have like a greasy texture, or both. You want to grate your cheese. So grating creates a greater surface area, so the heat can permeate more quickly. If you have large chunks that are kind of irregular in shape, they're going to melt at different rates, so the outside can overcook and become clumpy or oily, as above, before the inside of the chunk reaches the temperature to flow. So grate your cheese. Use low heat. Gradual temperature changes with a lower temperature will prevent the fat from separating out of the melting cheese. And it's always best to add cheese at the end of a cooking process. That way it can reach the melting point but not exceed it. That's why we usually add cheese to our soups and stews and whatnot as almost like a side dish. So you're sprinkling the cheese on top just as you finish the dish. And another example that may seem kind of counterintuitive before you finish, but it's not. It's making the cheese sauce for mac and cheese. So the sauce is made by browning flour in butter for a couple of minutes, and then you're adding the milk to make a thick sauce. And then that sauce, once it's thickened, you remove it from the heat before adding the cheese. You're not actually putting that cheese in there and cooking it and melting it. You're literally pulling it off, letting that begin to cool down. So as that sauce is cooling, the cheese is melting. Remember, it only needs 150 degrees for the cheese to melt. And lastly, the cheese and sauce mixture is then stirred into your choice of pasta. And though you've cooled it somewhat, it's still hot enough and melted, and it's hot enough to spread evenly through the dish. Then you add your Parmesan on top, the very dry Parmesan on top, and you pop it in the oven to heat it through, and you're going to brown that Parmesan. Voila, the best mac and cheese ever. So to have a good smooth melted cheese, adding acid. Now this is different than using acid to coagulate the cheese, and those cheeses won't melt. We're talking about adding acid to like a cheddar or a Gruyere. And it works great for making fondues, for sauces and soups. You can use white wine or lemon juice. So the added acid will bind to the calcium, as it did before, but this time it's in a melted cheese, and so it it binds to the calcium in the melted cheese and it keeps it separate from the protein so they can't clump together. The liquids of wine and lemon also add water to dilute the proteins, keep them flowing so it's smooth, 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 and moist. Add starch. So as in the mac and cheese example, flour or even cornstarch guards against clumping and stringiness. You'll actually see in your bagged cheeses that are in the grocery store where there have been already grated, they do put cornstarch in there or some other kind of agent to keep them from clumping together. The starch coats the proteins and the fats in the melted cheese or in the grated cheese, and that keeps the proteins in the melting cheese from clumping and the fats from separating out. Starch is binding them together. Starch always makes a fine glue to hold things together. So it can keep things separate and it can hold things together. Another tip is to stir gently. You will get there in time. Don't try to rush it. Overstirring encourages the proteins to clump. You don't want it to be clumpy or stringy. We want smooth melted cheese. Another tip, serve it hot. Melted cheese, it's much more likely to clump as it cools. So bring it up to temperature, the perfect temperature, and serve. Use the proper cheese. For a smooth melted cheese, use a well-aged cheddar. Or you could do a high moisture cream cheese. That will also melt beautifully. Save that mozzarella for a pizza. All right. Final thoughts. That will be it for today's podcast. I hope you're hungry now. I have a recipe on the website for that fabulous mac and cheese I talked about. Just go to www.peacefulheartfarm.com, click or tap the recipes on the menu, and I'll put a link in the show notes too, and all of my recipes are printable. Did you get the answer to the question of why does cheese melt? I hope so. Feel free to contact me if you have questions, and I will answer to the best of my ability. It's always good to hear from you. It makes my day. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please hop over to Apple Podcasts, subscribe, give me a 5-star rating and a review. Also, please share it with any friends or family who might be interested in this type of content. It is absolutely the best way to help us out on this show. Share, share, share on all your social media. Thank you so much for stopping by the homestead. And until next time, may God fill your life with grace and peace.